April 2nd, 1909, a moonlit night in the Big Horn Basin of Wyoming, 7 miles south of Ten Sleep. 2 sheep wagons sit quiet along Spring Creek. Inside, 5 men sleep: French sheepman Joe Alamand, his partner Joe M.G., a German immigrant who'd switched from cattle to sheep, Alamand's nephew Jules Lazier, and 2 hired sheepherders, Bounce Helmer and Pete Caffarel. They know they've crossed the deadline. Everyone knows. The invisible line that separates cattle country from sheep country runs along Ten Sleep Creek, and they're on the wrong side of it with 5,000 sheep. At 3 in the morning, 7 masked riders approach in silence. What happens next will finally end one of the deadliest conflicts in frontier history. A 50-year war that killed at least 54 men and slaughtered between 50,000 and 100,000 sheep across 8 states. A war over something that sounds absurd today: whether sheep had the right to eat grass. This is the story of the sheep wars, not Hollywood shootouts, not noble battles over justice. This was economic warfare with body counts, driven by a conflict so bitter that men would club thousands of lambs to death in a single night, dynamite entire flocks, and murder sheepherders in their sleep. And it all came down to one simple, terrible truth: sheep and cattle couldn't share the same land. At least, that's what the cattlemen believed. Between 1870 and 1920, the American West was cattle country. Texas longhorns, Wyoming ranches, Montana spreads covering hundreds of square miles. The open range belonged to cattle, and the men who raised them controlled everything: the water, the grass, the local governments, even the courts. Then came the sheep. In 1870, there were relatively few sheep on the western ranges. Cattle dominated. But by 1909, Wyoming alone had over 7 million sheep, nearly 8 times the number of cattle. The sheep industry's value had grown to $32 million, surpassing cattle's $26 million. The economics were simple and devastating to cattlemen. Sheep were more profitable per acre than cattle. Much more profitable. A single sheep cost less to raise than a cow. Sheep bred faster, often producing twins. They matured quicker. You could shear a sheep every year for wool, providing annual income, while cattle had to be fattened for 2 or 3 years before sale. Sheep survived harsh winters better than cattle. They could graze marginal land that cattle couldn't use. And after the Dingley Act of 1897 doubled tariffs on imported wool, American sheep ranchers could hardly lose money. The Dingley Act created a sheep boom. Between 1890 and 1900, Wyoming's sheep population jumped from 712,000 to over 5 million. Cattle numbers, meanwhile, plummeted from 1.5 million head in 1895 to just 706,000 by 1898. Cattlemen watched their kingdom disappear beneath a tide of wool and hooves. But the conflict wasn't just economic. Cattlemen genuinely believed, and some historians now confirm, that sheep permanently damaged rangeland in ways cattle didn't. Here's what they saw. Sheep grazed closer to the ground than cattle. While a cow would bite grass off at several inches, sheep cropped it down to nothing, sometimes pulling plants up by the roots. Their sharp cloven hooves compacted and cut up the soil, especially when thousands moved across the same ground. The compaction destroyed soil structure, reduced water infiltration, and made it harder for grass to regrow. After sheep passed through an area, cattlemen claimed the land smelled so bad that cattle wouldn't graze there for months. They said water sources became contaminated. They saw erosion where sheep had been. And they watched as native grasses gave way to weeds. In 1879, naturalist John Muir called sheep hoofed locusts. Later, frustrated by continued damage in Yosemite, he wrote, "As sheep advance, flowers, vegetation, grass, soil, plenty, and poetry vanish." Modern soil science partially validates these concerns. Studies show that intensive sheep grazing does increase soil compaction and erosion, particularly on wet soils. Sheep create more surface disturbance per animal than cattle because they're typically stocked at 5 times the density. Their smaller hooves penetrate deeper into soil relative to their weight. But here's what makes the story more complex. Cattle also damage soil. Modern research shows cattle actually create more compaction per animal than sheep because they're heavier. The real problem wasn't sheep versus cattle, it was overgrazing by either species. The cattlemen didn't care about nuance, they cared about survival. And they watched helplessly as their profit margins shrank and their ranges filled with sheep. The sheepmen, for their part, had every legal right to be there. The land was public domain. The federal government granted grazing permits without distinguishing between cattle and sheep. First come, first served. And sheep, being more mobile and easier to move, could reach high country and marginal lands that cattle couldn't access. The demographic divide made everything worse. Nearly all cattlemen were white Americans of European descent. Most had money, connections, and social standing. They belonged to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which wielded enormous political power. They knew judges, they knew sheriffs, they knew senators. Sheepherders, on the other hand, were outsiders. Many were Basque immigrants from the mountainous border between France and Spain. Others were Mexican, Native American, or Hispanic villagers from New Mexico. They came from poverty. They spoke little English. They worked jobs that most Americans wouldn't touch, spending months alone in the mountains watching flocks, sleeping in primitive sheep wagons, enduring a loneliness so complete that they carved messages into aspen trees just to leave some mark of their existence. These carvings, called arborglyphs, covered aspens across the West, names, dates, hometown memories, political messages like Gora Euskadi, long live the Basque country, love notes, poems. They were messages in bottles from men who spent entire seasons seeing no other humans except when they moved the flock or resupplied. The Basques became so synonymous with sheepherding that Basque and shepherd meant the same thing across much of the West. But here's the truth. Most Basque immigrants had never been professional sheepherders before coming to America. Some had tended a few sheep on small farms in Europe. Others came from fishing villages or cities and had never touched livestock. They took these jobs because sheepherding paid relatively well for work that didn't require English or special skills. It was brutal, isolating, dangerous work that Americans refused to do. But for young Basque men escaping poverty, it was opportunity. The first Basques arrived during the California Gold Rush in 1849. When gold didn't pan out, they moved inland. By the 1870s, California land prices pushed stockmen east into Nevada's Great Basin, then north into Idaho, Oregon, Wyoming, and Montana. Basque sheepherders followed, creating what historians call chain migration. One man would establish himself, then send for brothers, cousins, friends from the old country. They developed entire support systems. Basque boarding houses in towns like Boise, Elko, and Winnemucca provided housing, translation services, banking help, mail forwarding, and job connections. Basque women often ran these establishments, creating crucial bridges between the old world and the new. During World War II, when the sheep industry desperately needed labor, Senator Patrick McCarran of Nevada pushed through special legislation allowing Basque sheepherders to enter the country with permanent residency as workers with special skills. By 1954, over 1,100 Basque sheepherders had entered under these laws. But in the 1880s and 1890s, before these support systems fully developed, Basque sheepherders were simply targets. The violence started small. Warnings, threats, letters signed by dozens of cattlemen, turn back or we shoot the first sheep through the fence. When threats didn't work, cattlemen formed sheepshooter organizations. In Oregon, the sheepshooters bragged about killing 8,000 to 10,000 sheep in 1903 alone, burning camps and corrals. The raids followed a pattern. Masked men would approach a sheep camp at night. Sometimes they'd fire warning shots. Sometimes they'd shoot the sheepdogs first, often burning them alive tied to wagon wheels. Then they'd wade into the flock with clubs, rifles, and dynamite. Clubbing was horrifyingly common. Men would move through bedded sheep at night, swinging wooden clubs, crushing skulls, shattering legs. It was quieter than gunfire. One raid in 1905 on Shell Creek in Wyoming's Bighorn Basin left 4,000 sheep clubbed to death in a single night. The owner lost $40,000, nearly $1.5 million in today's money. Other methods were even more brutal. In 1896, near North Rock Springs, Wyoming, cattlemen drove 12,000 sheep off a cliff. All died. In Arizona in 1884, angry cattlemen rounded up over 100 wild horses, strapped cowbells to their necks and rawhide to their tails, then drove them into sheep herds totaling more than 25,000 animals while firing guns and screaming. The sheep scattered in all directions. Many were killed or wounded. It took a week to gather survivors. That same year in Arizona, cowboys drove over 4,000 sheep into the Little Colorado River, where they died in quicksand. The cattlemen rarely faced consequences. Between 1870 and 1909, despite at least 24 attacks in Wyoming alone and 6 confirmed deaths, not a single sheepherder murderer had been convicted in a Wyoming court. Local juries, filled with cattlemen and their supporters, refused to convict. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association used its political influence to protect its members. The sheepmen fought back, of course. They hired their own range detectives. They formed the Wyoming Wool Growers Association in 1905 to coordinate legal defenses and post rewards for information. They sent Joe LaForce, the famous detective who'd tracked down the notorious range detective Tom Horn, to investigate raids. But mostly, they just kept coming, because the money was too good to resist, which brings us back to that moonlit night in April 1909. Joe Alamond knew the risks. He'd always been a reasonable man, one who respected the unwritten rules that kept peace between sheep and cattle operators. But his partner, Joe MJ, was different. MJ was a hothead, a German immigrant who'd been a cattleman himself before he abandoned the business and went over to the enemy. That's how cattlemen described it. MJ went into sheep because they were more profitable. He didn't care about tradition or deadlines or cattlemen's feelings. In March 1909, Alamand and MJ moved their 5,000 sheep west across Spring Creek into cattle country. They even had a deputy sheriff escort them part of the way, hoping his presence would prevent violence. They split the herd between their 2 sheep wagons, one technically legal on the east side of the deadline, one technically illegal on the west. About a dozen dogs helped manage both camps. Word spread like wildfire across the western slope of the Bighorn Mountains. The deadline had been crossed. The sheepmen were back on cattle range. Something had to be done. 7 men gathered: Herbert Brink, a wealthy cattleman, George Sabin, Milton Alexander, Tom Dixon, Ed Eaton, Charles Ferris, and others. They wore masks, they carried rifles, and on the night of April 2nd, under a bright moon, they rode toward Spring Creek. What happened in those next minutes would change Wyoming forever. The raiders approached the 2 wagons silently. Then someone, likely Brink, shouted, "Show a light and come out." Gunfire exploded in the darkness. Witnesses later disagreed about whether the sheepmen fired back. But inside the north wagon, Joe MJ and Jules Lazier died almost immediately, their bodies riddled with bullets. The raiders set both wagons on fire with kerosene. Helmer and Caffarel, in the south wagon, escaped into the darkness and ran. The raiders didn't pursue them. Either they didn't see them, or they let them go as witnesses to spread fear. Joe Alamand staggered out of the burning north wagon. His hands were up. He was wounded but alive, walking slowly away from the flames with his arms raised in surrender. Herbert Brink shouted, "This is a hell of time and night to come up with your hands in the air." Then he shot Alamand dead. The raiders killed the dogs, shot about 25 sheep, burned both wagons completely. Then they rode away, leaving 3 bodies in the ashes. When Helmer and Caffarel reached authorities the next morning, a posse rode out to the scene. What they found was carnage. 3 dead men, 2 dogs, 24 sheep, everything destroyed, and a crime scene that finally, after 40 years of unpunished violence, would change everything. The Wyoming Wool Growers Association immediately posted a $5,000 reward for information leading to convictions, worth about $170,000 today. The National Wool Growers Association added $2,000. Bighorn County added $1,000. Even the state of Wyoming, in a half-hearted gesture, added $500. Total, $8,500. In 2025 money, about $280,000. Someone talked. Within weeks, 7 men were arrested. 2, Charles Ferris and his companion, turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. They testified against the others, and their testimony was damning. Ferris described Brink's murder of Alamand in detail: the raised hands, the mocking comment, the cold-blooded shot. Herbert Brink was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. When his fellow raiders saw this verdict, they stampeded to make deals with prosecutors. Brink's sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. George Sabin and Milton Alexander pled guilty to second-degree murder and received 25-year sentences. Tom Dixon and Ed Eaton each got 3 years for arson. On November 20th, 1909, the convicted raiders boarded a train from Basque to Rawlins to begin their sentences. Crowds packed the train station, not to condemn them, but to honor them. Townspeople gave them food, blankets, gifts. They were heroes in the eyes of many, heroes who'd stood up to the sheep invasion. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in Wyoming history, men had been convicted and sent to prison for killing sheepherders. The era of unpunished violence was over. The convictions from the Spring Creek Raid, as it came to be known, put an immediate stop to the mayhem. There were only 2 more sheep raids in Wyoming after 1909, in 1911 and 1912. No one was injured in either. No more murders. The last known sheep raid in adjacent Colorado occurred in 1920, when 150 sheep were killed for grazing in the White River National Forest. But here's the bitter footnote. George Sabin escaped from prison in 1913 while being transported on a work crew. He was never seen again, despite efforts by both authorities and his own family. Ed Eaton died in prison. Tom Dixon served his sentence and was paroled in 1912. Herbert Brink and Milton Alexander served exactly 5 years before Governor Joseph Carey, a well-known cattleman and member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, paroled them both in 1914, reducing their life and 25-year sentences to just 5 years served. The power of the cattlemen's associations remained immense, even in defeat. But the sheep wars were over, not because anyone won, but because the economics in the land itself were changing. Barbed wire fenced the open range. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 finally regulated public grazing with permits and defined allotments. National forests established boundaries. Homesteaders claimed more land. The endless grass that both cattlemen and sheepmen had fought over was disappearing beneath farms, fences, and regulations, and wool prices began their long decline. The Great Depression hit agriculture hard, lasting 20 years in Wyoming, twice as long as in the rest of the nation. By the 1940s, sheep numbers were falling. Today, Wyoming has about 1/20th the sheep it had in 1909. The cattlemen got their ranges back, not through violence, through time, economics, and the slow bureaucratization of the West, but the sheep wars left scars deeper than economics. Between 1870 and 1920, at least 54 men died in approximately 120 violent encounters across 8 states. Most victims were sheepherders, many of them Basque immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity and found bullets instead. Between 50,000 and 100,000 sheep were slaughtered. Millions of dollars in property was destroyed. Entire livelihoods were wiped out in single nights of violence. And for 40 years, the men who committed these crimes walked free. protected by local juries, shielded by powerful associations, defended by the simple argument that they were protecting their way of life from foreign invaders who didn't understand the land. It took the Spring Creek raid, 3 men murdered in their sleep, their bodies burned in wagons, shot while trying to surrender, to finally convince the West that law mattered more than range. Joe Alamond left behind a wife, Adele, and a young son, Joe Jr. Jules Lazier's family mourned a young man who'd simply been working a job. Joe M.J., the hothead who'd switched from cattle to sheep for profit, paid for that choice with his life. The men who killed them served, at most, 5 years. And when they walked out of prison, they returned to communities that still saw them as heroes. That's the truth of the sheep wars. Not a clean story of good versus evil. Not a simple tale of economic competition. It was frontier capitalism at its rawest, where men who controlled the grass controlled everything, where violence was cheaper than legal process, and where immigrant workers bore the cost of other men's profits and prejudices. 3 monuments mark the Spring Creek raid site today, 7 miles south of 10 Sleep on State Highway 434. One stands where the south wagon burned. Another marks where the north wagon stood, where 3 men died. A third remembers the 3 Joes, Alamand, Emja, and Lazier. The Bighorn Basin is quiet now. Cattle graze. Some sheep remain, much fewer than before. The grass grows, the creek flows. And if you stand where those monuments are and listen carefully, you might almost hear what those men heard in 1909. The approach of horses in the darkness, the shouted command, the gunfire that changed everything. The sheep wars killed 54 men and 100,000 sheep. But the final casualty was the myth of the lawless West, the idea that might made right, that local power trumped justice, that you could solve economic conflicts with bullets and get away with it forever. On April 2nd, 1909, that myth died in the flames of 2 sheep wagons along Spring Creek, and the frontier, such as it was, finally began to grow up.